The Second World War began at 4:26 in the morning on the 1st of September, when the Luftwaffe carried out its very first combat sortie. A Junkers 87 dive bomber, piloted by Bruno Delay, executed the initial bombing raid on Polish targets. However, this is only the formal version of events accepted in historiography. In reality, the war began with the phrase, "Grandmother has died." Where did this mysterious expression come from? We already touched upon the background of the conflict in the episode about the Munich Agreement. If you have not watched it yet, do take a look. Now, let us briefly review the prerequisites of the Second World War. In fact, it erupted for the very same reasons as the First World War. Germany, having been defeated in the first, was pushed out of the colonial race. It desperately needed new markets for capital and trade, as well as colonies. Therefore, the Germans proposed that the Western powers share. The result was the outbreak of the First World War, which Germany lost in disgrace. Under the Versailles and Versailles-Washington systems, the country was subjected to crushing reparations. Even the very authors of these conditions admitted that several generations of Germans would be unable to pay them off, even if they worked without rest. Germany received 2 demilitarized zones, severe restrictions on the size of its army and navy, and a long list of other humiliating clauses. In addition, 2 massive imperial collapses followed the First World War. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated, and most significantly, the Russian Empire fell apart. A number of new states appeared on the map. The Baltic countries and Finland gained independence. Poland was restored as a sovereign state. Hungary emerged after the breakup of Austria-Hungary, and new entities were established in the Balkans. The political map of Europe was reshaped almost from scratch. But for Germany, Versailles was a national disgrace, political, moral, and economic. The Germans longed for revenge, and Hitler, once he came to power, skillfully sensed the mood of the masses. He began building a new militarized state, with the clear objective of reclaiming lost territories and becoming the hegemon of Western Europe. These were, in essence, the roots of the Second World War. It was obvious that Hitler's main adversaries would be France and Britain, the 2 key opponents. Of course, the Soviet Union also stood in the picture, but its role was highly ambiguous. A logical question arises. Why did the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and the United States not unite at once and stop Hitler in his infancy? Why did they not act after the Anschluss of Austria, after the annexation of Czechoslovakia, or even after the attack on Poland? The answer is simple. No true alliance existed. Britain and France saw Stalin's Soviet Union as no less a threat than Nazi Germany and feared it deeply. In fact, they were drafting plans for military operations against the USSR. The Soviet Union, for its part, did not stand aside. By signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, essentially an allied treaty with Hitler, it began expanding its frontiers, reclaiming the former lands of the Russian Empire. Meanwhile, America pursued a policy of non-intervention. Washington believed that sooner or later they would face war with Japan, and indeed, such a war did come. Thus, at that time, there were no real allies. Britain and France acted in relative coordination, but even they betrayed Czechoslovakia at Munich. Yet both powers guaranteed a mutual defense pact with Poland. Poland itself, on the eve of war with Germany, held a very contradictory position. Let us recall, at one stage, Poland acted as Hitler's partner. During the partition of Czechoslovakia, it received the Teschen region and felt rather confident. And so the war began with the so-called Polish Corridor. The situation looked like this. On one side lay the lands of Prussia, on the other the main territory of Germany. Between them stretched the Polish Corridor, along with the free city of Danzig. The German lands were literally split apart. This raised numerous questions. How should goods transit be organized? Should fees be paid for it? What would be the status of the German population? Eventually, the Germans began appealing to the Poles with the proposal, "Give us this corridor, and we will reunite the German lands. And in return, we will give you." Negotiations begin, and in general continue throughout the whole 39th year. And the Germans say, "In return, we will, for example, give you lands of Soviet Ukraine. Because we also sense that there will be a war with Stalin, you will support us. You have the theory of a greater Poland from sea to sea, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. You will get these Ukrainian lands and give us the Polish Corridor." The Poles rejected that proposal. In other words, they were not opposed to, accordingly, participating in a war against the Soviet Union. At that time, their relations with Germany were, broadly speaking, defined by the signed Non-Aggression and Cooperation Pact. They had absolutely no objections to acquiring Ukrainian lands, but they also did not want to give up the Polish corridor, and so the pressure began. Hitler understood this. Meetings were already being held in the general staffs throughout the first half of 1939 that war could not be avoided. All that was needed was a pretext. There were constant stories put about that the Poles were violating the border, that the Poles were staging provocations. The Poles denied this. They said, "We are not staging any provocations," because indeed the Polish army was weaker, and of course the Poles did not want any war with Hitler. But some pretext was needed, and in fact, a plan emerged that was called Operation Himmler. Sports fans know that the great football goalkeeper Lev Yashin also stood in goal in hockey. He won cups in both sports. Yashin was even invited to the Soviet national hockey team, but he refused, deciding to devote himself to football. The Continental Hockey League season 2024 is also not without interesting facts. Quite recently, Tinkoff became the first bank in history to be the league's general partner. On this occasion, it even issued a limited series of debit cards with a unique design. You can apply for such a card until the 31st of July and at the same time participate in a draw for season tickets to every match of your favorite teams. Purchase a KHL match ticket in any convenient way using the card and receive a pleasant bonus from the bank, up to 500 rubles in cash back for the purchase. Follow the link in the description and apply for the Tinkoff card in the limited design right now. The link is already waiting for you in the description. Under the plan, it was necessary to arrange a number of provocations apparently coming from the Poles, so that those provocations would be convincing and could be photographed. Preferably, there should be victims among the German population, so this could be presented to Western public opinion with the claim, "See, the Poles attacked us. What can we do? We must defend ourselves." After all, the Third Reich cannot simply fail to defend its lands, and so an operation arose that received the code name Conserve, canned goods. The head of the RSH, Heydrich, worked out the story. Let's do the following. We have a border radio station in the German town of Glewitz. Let's have the Poles seize it. For that we will take SS officers, dress them in Polish uniforms, attack our own radio station, fire shots at the walls, and broadcast in Polish that Great Poland has begun an invasion of Germany because it can no longer tolerate Nazi oppression, and so on and so forth. For the broadcast, they selected Volksdeutsche, Germans born in Poland who spoke Polish, so they could tell a story on air in Polish. There was only one snag: corpses. You don't really want to butcher your own people to pieces, so that's why it was called canned goods. Prisoners already sentenced to death were taken from concentration camps. They were given injections, dressed in Polish uniforms. Some were dressed in German uniforms, and the whole staging was arranged. A Polish detachment supposedly entered, a firefight began, and thus the Poles captured the radio station. There would be Polish corpses, German corpses, photographs. Oh, the horror! What a nightmare! What tyranny! Where did the phrase "grandmother has died" come from? The head of this operation was one of Heydrich's subordinates, named Naujok. He was responsible for the operation. He sat in a hotel and awaited the prearranged signal. The prearranged signal was that someone would call his hotel room and say, "Grandmother has died." And so, on the 31st of August, he sat in the hotel and received such a call. "Grandmother has died," and he immediately set about the operation to seize the radio station in Gleiwitz. A live broadcast was aired claiming that the Poles were preparing an offensive, and Hitler began, as they say, to alarm Western public opinion and to say, "Well, look at this horror. We must now go on the defensive." Hitler did not speak of war. He framed it as a Polish campaign, arguing that we must secure the safety of our borders. What was Hitler's plan? To smash Poland quickly. Germany reckoned that neither England nor France would stand up for Poland in the same way they had betrayed Czechoslovakia, and then sit down at the negotiating table and say, "Listen, well, it happened. The Polish army has already capitulated. Let's negotiate, hold a peace conference now, discuss this and that. We have taken the Polish corridor, yada yada, everything's settled, peace, friendship, chewing gum." It was obvious that no peace and chewing gum existed in Hitler's mind. He saw Poland as a large springboard that threatened the Reich. It was vast territory, industry, agriculture, and expansion of Lebensraum. The main thesis of Hitler's Germany was the expansion of the Third Reich's living space. In other words, we must expand. We need pastures. We need agriculture. We need governance, because we want to become the leading power in Europe. Accordingly, by seizing Poland, one could already think about war with France on the continent. Either they would not go to war with us, or if they did, we would defeat them. And then England, we would confine them to the island. The Soviet Union did not threaten us because we had signed a treaty with the Soviet Union, that very Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which we will speak about in a few minutes. After the First World War, Germany found itself in a very difficult position because it had to rebuild its army and build a navy. The navy was limited by the Versailles Treaty to a certain tonnage of ships. It was necessary somewhere to train its troops, to train its tank armies. In Germany, that was impossible because the French and the British were watching, and relations developed between the Soviet Union and Germany. The Soviet Union received technologies from Germany. German officers trained at tank and aviation ranges in the Soviet Union. Accordingly, the Soviet Union sold resources to Germany, sold grain, sold oil, everything Germany needed. So it was quite a mutually beneficial cooperation. A month before the war, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was concluded, about which, of course, there are several basic perspectives that we should go through. Well, the first perspective is that Stalin and Hitler divided Europe between them, and that in Stalin's mind, it was the same idea that he would later seize Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other countries. But in fact, again, this is my version of events. We do not know what was in Stalin's head. Nobody knows. Obviously, Stalin wanted to regain the lands that had been part of the Russian Empire. Yes, and obviously the army called the Red Army was at that moment being built. The army was receiving new weapons, and obviously, to be sure, that was in Stalin's mind on the one hand. On the other hand, Stalin certainly understood that war with Hitler would happen sooner or later, and this diplomatic agreement was a step to delay that war for as long as possible. In fact, he delayed it by 2 years. During that time, the Soviet Army managed to carry out some reforms, to mobilize, to deploy forces. As we will see in 1941, they did not complete this fully, and thirdly, before signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, there had been negotiations in March and April of 1939 with the French and the British, and Stalin was offering them to form military-economic alliances that would guarantee allied and economic relations. All those negotiations reached a dead end, and of course, England and France, why I said that they, broadly speaking, considered Stalin the same kind of enemy, at some point pushed Stalin toward making a deal with Hitler, because they understood that war was looming over Europe. In that war, the Soviet Union should take a very advantageous position. We, the Soviet Union, that is. Let Germany, France, and England exhaust themselves in war, and we will pursue our foreign policy objectives. Perhaps we will not even enter the war at all. I suppose that roughly such a set of basic ideas was in Stalin's head at that moment. But, I repeat, the Soviet Union sought agreements both with England and with France. Those negotiations reached an impasse. Whereas the negotiations with Hitler unfolded lightning fast, within 2 months everything was signed, because Hitler instructed Ribbentrop to agree at once to what Stalin asked for, since it was very advantageous for us. It would secure us against war on 2 fronts. In reality, on 3 fronts. The Polish campaign, God forbid a campaign also against the Soviet Union, and God forbid another campaign against England and France. Germany did not need that. What was needed was to calmly crush Poland. And so, in fact, Hitler, with his hands free, entered this war. Then it began. Grandmother has died, the radio station was seized, and German troops moved into Poland. As I mentioned earlier, at 4:26 in the morning, the first bombings took place. At 4:45, in the free city of Danzig, shots were fired. A week before, the outdated German battleship Schleswig-Holstein had arrived there on a so-called friendly visit, and it immediately opened fire on Polish fortifications. On that very same day, the first air duel took place. Frank Neubert, a Luftwaffe pilot, shot down the first Polish fighter. That was it. The war had begun. There was no stopping it. The story of many successful products begins with good advertising, and today, in the conditions of growing competition, effective advertising has become one of the most important tools for business development. The good news is that launching an effective campaign can be done with minimal budgets, in just a couple of clicks. MTS Marketer can help you with this. Already, the service offers more than 16 tools for working across different platforms. For example, There's a unique feature to launch targeted ads in Telegram using MTS big data segments. With it, your ads will be seen only by users who match your chosen parameters. Unlike channel-based launches, this option significantly saves budget, and you don't need special skills to set it up. Everything can be done in just 5 to 10 minutes. Visit the website, register with your phone number, go to the Telegram Ads launch menu, set filters, gender, age, interests, and geography of your audience. This is very convenient because ad display can be set with maximum precision down to the user's district. Once you enter the necessary settings, you compose the ad text, define the campaign budget, and launch it. As you can see, everything works very simply. And if you have questions, you can always get help from a personal manager. Therefore, friends, for launching effective ad campaigns, I recommend MTS Marketer. The link is already waiting for you in the description. On the day of the invasion, the 1st of September, the Soviet Union lowered the draft age from 21 to 19. In fact, the USSR was preparing a hidden mobilization, deploying troops and moving them toward the Polish border. When I said the war had begun and the situation could no longer be saved, there was still an attempt to rescue it. On the 2nd of September, Mussolini, the head of Italy, proposed to convene a peace conference with Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. But Italy at that moment meant nothing in Europe, and the French and the British said, "Yes, fine, let's gather a peace conference." First, however, the Germans must withdraw all their troops from Czechoslovakia and Poland and halt their offensive. Then we will negotiate. Naturally, Hitler refused, and on the 3rd of September, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Following them, the British dominions also declared war. Australia, New Zealand, India, and South Africa all declared war. Canada would follow shortly after. The case of Spain is particularly interesting. Spaniards viewed Francisco Franco extremely negatively, a man who unleashed a civil war, who plunged Spain into blood, deprived Catalonia of independence, deprived the Basques of independence, and crushed all internal self-rule. But what Spaniards remained grateful to him for was that Franco, in some miraculous way, we will later see how, managed to keep Spain out of the Second World War. Spain was the first country to declare its neutrality, saying, "We will not participate. We are on no one's side. Our ports are open. Our banking system is open, but we are not involved. We conduct business as usual." Events from the first minutes of the match, so to speak, unfolded catastrophically, and by the 5th of September, Poland evacuated its government and gold reserves from Warsaw to Lublin. At that moment, two armies, Klug's Fourth Army and Kukler's Third Army, had already encircled one Polish army, and the Poles began surrendering as prisoners. By the 6th of September, the Germans had taken Krakow. Now let us shift to the other side of the world. If I were writing this blog as a Chinese author, I would have begun from a completely different point. I would have started by saying, yes, of course, in Europe, some hostilities are beginning. Hitler is attacking Poland. But here in China, we have for some time already been enduring a terrible bloody war with the Japanese. The Japanese unleashed a full-scale war in China, and they were in conflict while the Americans, the British, and the French were trying to calm it. But the Japanese insisted on creating a puppet government that would guarantee Japan's economic interests. And in fact, what was happening was a bloody slaughter. In addition, The Japanese periodically invaded Mongolia, leading to clashes with the Soviet Army. In particular, on the 5th of September, two Japanese battalions broke through once again in an attempt to seize the Khalkhin Gol Heights and lost 350 men there. Thus, the Japanese were also in a state of permanent military conflict with the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, as I already mentioned, the Germans had taken Krakow, and the Soviet Union was carrying out its hidden mobilization. Troop deployments were beginning. In Germany, the first serious censorship measure was introduced: the death penalty for threats to Germany's defensive strength. In other words, any action such as sabotage, diversionary acts, or incitement to sabotage that could affect defense-related or military enterprises were punishable by death. You may ask me, listen, the French and the British declared war on the 3rd of September. You tell us, Sergei, about the 6th of September. So what are the French and the British doing? The French and the British, mainly the French, proceeded to what would later be called the Phoney War. The French army, fulfilling its Allied obligations to Poland, advanced into the Rhineland Valley and occupied 12 German localities. It would seem that now Germany would be struck in the rear, that the British would join in, and that the much-feared two-front war would begin. But that war did not materialize. In the Rhineland Valley, there was a fortified line called the Siegfried Line, a German defensive belt. After the First World War, this was a very popular tactic, to construct a series of trenches in permanent firing positions, ideally multi-level, with batteries and arsenals underground, hospitals and communications above, anti-tank obstacles, and so on. Several such lines existed in Europe. In France, the line was called the Maginot Line, on the axis of a possible German strike. In Germany, in the Rhineland Valley, it was the Siegfried Line. In Finland, on the Karelian Isthmus, the Mannerheim Line. And Belgium had a similar line protecting the Albert Canal. The idea was to sit in these long-term firing positions with deep trenches and wage positional trench warfare, much like in the First World War. One of the main reasons for France's defeat later was an outdated military doctrine that expected a long, immobile trench war. But German armored wedges and sudden thrusts would tear the French army apart for that. So France moved troops into the Rhineland Valley, seized 12 localities, and then fell silent. Nothing happened, and nothing would happen for a year. You might be surprised. For a year the French sat there. There were occasional artillery exchanges, a few reconnaissance flights. The French sometimes bombed the Ruhr. It was absolute madness. And in France at that time, a cult of aggressive defense arose. We sit on German territory and guarantee the Germans will not attack us. This was the so-called Phoney War, and it lasted for a year. On the 9th of September, the Polish army Poznan, under the command of Tadeusz Kurzeba, began a major engagement with the German Eighth Army under General of the Infantry, Johann Blaskowitz. The Poles lost that battle. Then catastrophe followed. The Germans reached the suburbs of Warsaw, and on the 12th of September, surrounded near Radom, a Polish army surrendered. 60,000 Poles were taken prisoner. And what did the French do at that moment, as they were still in the Rhineland, when they received these news from Poland? The French General Staff issued an order to halt, citing the rapid development of events in Poland, a paradoxical decision. The Germans had not even taken Warsaw yet. They understood they could not capture it immediately, so they replaced the tank divisions that had broken through toward Warsaw with infantry, and put Warsaw under siege. The German 14th Army pushed toward the city of Lviv. Here is another important point. Before the war, the Germans flirted with Ukrainian nationalists. Sushko recruited agents because, obviously, Ukrainians had serious national grievances with the Poles, and the Germans tried, using this network, to carry out sabotage and destabilize Poland's rear, because the situation with the Soviet Union was still unclear. This was all before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The moment Hitler signed with the Soviet Union, Sushko and the Western nationalists were immediately forgotten, because it became clear they would no longer be needed. All the guarantees that had been given to them, "We will move into Poland now, and Western Ukraine we will hand to you so you will have a Ukrainian state," were instantly abandoned. And so, German troops reached the outskirts of Lviv, which at that time was, of course, Polish territory. On the 14th of September, Guderian's tanks broke through to Brest, and the Poles began defending the Brest fortress. They would defend it heroically for several days, but eventually it fell, and by the 14th of September, the Germans had completed the encirclement of Warsaw. In other words, from the 1st to the 14th, 14 days was all the German army needed to utterly crush the Poles. At this moment, a meeting took place in Moscow. Participating were People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Molotov, and the German ambassador, Schulenburg. Molotov stated, "Dear friends, according to our pact, we wish to protect the interests of the working and peasant classes of Belarus and Western Ukraine. We wish to reunite Western Ukraine with its eastern brothers. Therefore, our troops are ready to enter Poland. Please inform us once Warsaw falls." Schulenburg replied that it would take a few more days, after which they could safely move their forces into Poland. It must be said that such meetings between Molotov and Schulenburg were held not daily, but several times a week, with negotiations between the Germans and the Soviet government discussing various matters. For Hitler, this was extremely important. He constantly kept his hand on Stalin's pulse. How would Stalin behave? What would happen next? This was one of the first such meetings during the Polish campaign. By the 15th of September, the German army had reached the line Bialystok, Bielsk, Brest, Litovsk, Osowiec. Do you remember the episode about Osowiec? In this war, there would be no heroic storming or defense of the fortress. This was already Polish territory. The German troops advanced to this line of the front, blockaded Lviv, and issued a 12-hour ultimatum to Warsaw. Within 12 hours, the city must disarm, civilians must leave, or surrender. We give you 12 hours, after which we will storm the city. The Poles rejected the ultimatum. On the 6th, Army Group North and Army Group South of Germany linked up and encircled two Polish armies at once, practically the last living combat resource of Poland. The Polish government appealed to Romania for transit, essentially saying, "We will flee into Romanian territory and from there go to France." The Romanians agreed to accept the Poles. Very well, run. What else can be said? The Germans began their assault on Warsaw. The Poles requested the evacuation of civilians. The Germans refused. "We gave you 12 hours. You did not accept. Now it is too late." At 6 in the morning on the 17th of September, the Soviet Union crossed the border into Poland. The Red Army entered, and Molotov announced on the radio that the Polish state had collapsed, that they must protect the brotherly Belarusian and Ukrainian peoples groaning under the power of capitalists and landlords, and that these lands must return home. Soviet troops entered western Ukraine and western Belarus. On that very day, another important event occurred. A truce was signed between the Soviet Union and Japan. I already spoke about this in the episode on Pearl Harbor. If you have not seen it, please do. The Japanese were deciding which front to open after China, either war with Russia or war with America. This truce with the Soviet Union, the first such agreement, was part of a diplomatic game. Japan was not ready to attack the USSR. The Japanese had too few tanks, and they could not imagine how to wage war across such vast Russian spaces. So they signed a truce. On the 18th of September, the Soviet army entered the city of Vilna, today Vilnius, capital of Lithuania. At that time, it was a Polish city, and so the Red Army marched in. Then came the first meeting between German and Soviet troops in the area of Brest-Litovsk. On the 19th of September, another disaster struck near the Bzura River. A Polish army capitulated, with 170,000 men taken prisoner. Meanwhile, at sea, the Germans sank the first British warship, Courageous. And what did the British do? Did they bomb Berlin at that moment? Or at least Hamburg or Kiel, or perhaps the island of Sylt near Denmark, where German batteries stood? No. The British were engaged in what they considered a serious matter. They scattered millions of leaflets over Germany. It must be said that British propaganda had been very strong during the First World War. I mentioned this in the episode about that war, and now again they began an ideological campaign, scattering leaflets. They had done the same during the First World War. While armies sat in trenches, propaganda would undermine the morale of the rear, and now they attempted the same again. Of course, it produced no result. German society was swept by enormous enthusiasm. We are victorious in Poland, the people are united, and so on. The leaflets had no effect. Within Germany, however, the economic situation was difficult. Ration cards were introduced for the first time for bread, meat, and butter. An interesting topic, not strictly for this episode, nor perhaps for a historical block in general, is how rationing would reflect dietary consumption in different countries. And so, the Germans introduced ration cards for bread, meat, and butter. The British would later introduce their first ration cards for bacon, ham, butter, and meat. Bacon and ham were absent from the German set. The French still stood quietly in their positions, dug into the Rhineland zone, doing nothing. Meanwhile, Voroshilov met in Moscow with the German military attaché, and plans were drawn up in line with diplomatic agreements regarding when the German army would vacate the territories of western Ukraine and western Belarus, and when Soviet troops would move in. On the 21st of September in Warsaw, a civilian uprising broke out. Policemen who had remained in the city, soldiers left behind, and ordinary civilians rose up. It was, of course, quickly crushed. At the same time, the Soviet Union and Germany discussed the demarcation line. In fact, they were discussing a new border. Since Poland had vanished, the Soviet Union and Germany now shared a common frontier. What was the Western press writing? I will not quote Soviet newspapers, as they could always be accused of propaganda, and indeed, they were propaganda, just as German, British, and French newspapers all had their own propaganda. Instead, I'll cite the Daily Worker, an American newspaper, which reported that the Red Army, entering western Ukraine and western Belarus, was greeted enthusiastically everywhere by the local population, and photographs confirm these meetings. That is what the Americans wrote. On the 22nd of September, a joint parade of the German Army and the Red Army took place in Brest, where their columns marched past their commanders, showing that the two countries had agreed that they now had a common border and that their armed forces had together sealed the end of Poland. On the 23rd of September, the German High Command declared the Polish campaign complete. Here is another aside. Hitler, in his speech on the 1st of September at the outbreak of the war, wore a military uniform for the first time in many years. From then on, he would give all his most important speeches in uniform, emphasizing, as he always did, that he was a simple corporal, that he had seen war from the trenches and fed lice, unlike those Prussian generals. This narrative of Hitler as the simple soldier would be used throughout the war by the German press. On the 24th of September, British troops were finally deployed to France. Parliament had spent a long time bargaining with the French over troop numbers and plans. By the time the plans were drawn up, Poland had already been overrun by Germany. Only then, on the 24th, did the British begin moving troops into France, preparing seriously for combat. What was happening in Moscow? Moscow began playing a new diplomatic game. The question of Western Ukraine and Western Belarus was resolved, but other issues concerned Stalin and his government, the fate of the Baltic states and of Finland. A new diplomatic chapter began with the Baltics. Molotov met in Moscow with Estonian representatives to discuss a trade agreement. According to the Estonians, the trade agreement itself was discussed for about 15 minutes. Then Molotov moved to the point. Listen, trade is all well and good, but let's get to the substance. We need bases in Estonia because we believe the war in Europe will intensify, and it is unclear who will strike the Soviet Union. Germany may be peaceful with us today, but tomorrow that could end. Britain and France are clearly unfriendly. We do not want the Baltic territories used as springboards for an enemy army to roll into Soviet lands. Molotov then told the Estonians bluntly, "We want to place a Soviet military base in Estonia with a limited contingent of about 15 to 20,000 troops." On the 25th of September, the Germans began bombing Warsaw, a barbaric bombardment with no military sense, aimed only at intimidation. The message was, "You dare raise uprisings and civil resistance? We will flatten you with bombs and settle the matter in 15 minutes. On that same day, Hitler signed an interesting document. Although there was an Allied pact with the Soviet Union and the Baltics were defined as a Soviet sphere of interest, Hitler ordered preparations for an invasion and seizure of Lithuania. Meanwhile, in Germany, rationing continued to expand to more basic products. On the 25th of September, the Bulgarian press reported that Ukrainians, and especially Belarusians, were extraordinarily inspired that the Red Army had entered their lands and that they would now become part of the Soviet Union. The Estonians in Moscow quickly signed documents with Molotov, agreeing to a trade treaty with the USSR and the placement of a Soviet military base and a contingent of 25,000 troops on Estonian territory. On the 26th of September, German forces launched a full assault on Warsaw, while Ribbentrop flew to Moscow to propose to Stalin and Molotov a new treaty, not one about a demarcation line, but a treaty on a common border. Let us shift for a moment to France. The main enemy was Germany. Preparations were being made for war with Germany, and French troops were in the Rhineland. But inside France, the Communist Party was banned outright. This shows again how the French, more so than the British, viewed the communist threat at that time. It is important to note here that leftist ideas, communist ideas, were immensely popular in post-First World War Europe. The International, the women's movements, all were heavily leftist. The ideas of equality, brotherhood, social justice, these were wildly popular in capitalist Europe and, not surprisingly, feared by the French, the British, and the Germans alike. These ideas gripped the intelligentsia and elites, who carried them into the masses. From this perspective, the French acted in line with Western governments. They banned the Communist Party of France. By the 28th of September, Warsaw had fallen. German troops entered the city. From then until 1945, no one would seriously speak of Polish statehood. On that same day, Stalin received ratification documents for the treaty with Estonia. He signed them and said to the Estonians, "You did well to sign. Very far-sighted. Otherwise, what happened to Poland might have happened to you." By the end of September, Hitler had solved his main tasks. He had avoided a two-front war. From the 29th of September into early October, freed from the war in Poland, German units were redeployed west. United Press, the American agency, would later describe this situation with a new phrase, the Phoney War. Their journalist arrived and reported, "Something strange is happening. The French are sitting in trenches, journalists visit them, women are even there, they drink wine on weekends. Meanwhile, German trains carrying troops roll by on the other side, and no one bombs them, no one shoots at them, nothing happens at all. What is this? A phony war." United Press was the first to name it that. Meanwhile, Germany and the Soviet Union continued working on their new border treaty called the Treaty of Friendship and Border. And in France, Sikorsky's Polish government in exile was established. Two centers of such exiled governments would form at first, then only one, London. Every country occupied by Germany would set up a government in exile, and the Poles would first go to France, then move to London after France's fall. There, they would be joined by the Norwegian government, part of the Czechoslovak government, and others, creating a hub of exiled governments. In France, after banning the Communist Party, the authorities went further and confiscated all its property. This drew criticism from their allies in Britain, who said that such actions contradicted freedom of expression and political choice. The French would not listen to anyone, and their war against the communists continued. On the other side of the world, the Japanese bombed Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan province, marking the beginning of the large Sichuan campaign. By the 10th of October, German forces, freed from the war in Poland, had been redeployed in great numbers to the Western Front. The French, observing this, scratched their heads and pulled their forces back behind the Maginot Line. There they sat in their bunkers smoking, listening to gramophone records, and laughing at the Germans, believing the Maginot Line to be practically impregnable. It was the most modern defensive system of its time, and the French felt entirely safe behind it. Meanwhile, Warsaw was occupied. Repressive actions by the SS and Sonderkommandos began, and the Polish underground movement formed in the city. It was called the Service for Poland's Victory, a clandestine organization that would wage partisan warfare against the Germans throughout the Second World War. The New York Times published a report on the Soviet-Estonian trade treaty, sharply commenting that the small country had been forced into what was essentially a military agreement. The Estonians could do nothing about it. The Baltic states are gradually falling to Stalin, the New York Times wrote. What was happening in America at that moment? The Pan-American Declaration was adopted. One of its key points established a security zone extending 300 to 1,000 kilometers from the American continent. This zone would be patrolled mainly by U.S. naval vessels. Latin American countries could join if they wished, but in effect, this meant that the United States asserted control over navigation and movement in parts of both the Atlantic and the Pacific. In other words, while the Soviet Union sought to shield itself by stationing troops in the Baltics and later by going to war with Finland, the United States signaled to its Latin American neighbors and indirectly to Japan that it controlled the seas around its continent and that nothing would happen there without its consent. Step by step, every major power was trying to build protective buffers, whether from neighboring states or from surrounding seas. On the 4th of October, the British cabinet approved the Balfour Plan, the plan to create a Jewish state in Palestine. This is not the main subject of our story, but it is an important episode as it showed Britain's inconsistent policy toward the Jewish question. On the one hand, it seemed to support the creation of a Jewish state, while on the other, Britain later blocked Romanian ships carrying Jewish refugees to Palestine. That route could have been one of the safest avenues of evacuation for Jews, but the British cut it off, claiming Palestine could not take more people. This decision would later prove tragic, as the Nazis began their war of extermination. For now, though, it was still just the Balfour Plan. On the 5th of October, Hitler held a military parade in Warsaw. In his speech, he declared that the Reich was safe, that the Polish military beast, which had supposedly attacked Germany, had been crushed, and he spoke all the usual words of triumph. Poland was to be annexed, and a general government established in its place. In Moscow, Molotov met with representatives of the next Baltic state, Lithuania. The same proposal was made as to Estonia, a trade treaty, plus the stationing of a Soviet military base and a limited contingent of 25,000 troops. The same offer was extended to Finland, though the Soviets had little expectation the Finns would agree. Here is an important note about the Finnish question. After the Russian Revolution and the collapse of the empire, Finland had gained independence. In 1918, the First War in Karelia broke out, with Finns fighting units of the Red Army. At that time, Mannerheim made his famous sword oath, vowing to drive Lenin's bandits out of Finland. Among Finland's nationalist circles, the idea of Greater Finland was born, a state that would include Karelia and parts of Ingria. Today this sounds like a curious historical footnote, but at the time these were serious expansionist dreams, no different from the idea of a Greater Poland stretching from sea to sea. Thus, before the Second World War, Finland's ruling elite were strongly anti-Soviet, even though, after the war, Finland's relations with the USSR would become remarkably good. On the 6th of October, Hitler sent secret diplomatic messages to London and Paris, suggesting the possibility of peace talks. His message was essentially, the Polish question has been solved. It is no longer on the table. Shall we negotiate? The French and British rejected the idea outright. Meanwhile, the Japanese launched yet another offensive in China. To give you a sense of scale, on one stretch of the front, 90,000 Japanese soldiers faced 180,000 Chinese. It was a war of annihilation, brutal and bloody. After Britain and France rejected Hitler's overtures, he made a public statement declaring that in Eastern Europe, lasting peace had finally been achieved, and that the interests of peace were shared fully by Germany and the Soviet Union. The newspaper Pravda quoted him. The Germans waited another day for a possible change of heart in London or Paris, but none came. And so, on the 8th of October, Hitler issued a decree. Poland was to be liquidated. Poland no longer existed. In its place stood the general government. The first governor-general would be the vile Hans Frank, a man who drowned Poland in blood, who created the Jewish ghettos, and who was, without exaggeration, a despicable figure. But the fact remained. Poland no longer existed. It was now the general government. At that same time, the Germans learned that the Soviet Union was in talks with Turkey. Turkey, a southern neighbor of the USSR, was under the influence of France and Britain. Negotiations were underway about a possible alliance, about whose side Turkey would ultimately take, and whether it could be used as a staging ground for an attack on the Soviet Union's southern borders. This information was leaked to Berlin, and the German ambassador Schulenburg confronted Molotov in Moscow. "What are you discussing with the Turks?" The Soviet Foreign Ministry issued a communiqué saying, "We don't understand our German partners' nervousness. We talk to the Turks about whatever we wish. Nothing we are doing is directed against you." Nevertheless, a report went to Hitler that the USSR was scheming with Turkey, while at the same time moving into Estonia, preparing to do the same in Latvia and Lithuania, and now also negotiating in the south. On the 9th of October, Hitler took his next step. He signed Directive Gelb, the plan that laid out the attack on France and the destruction of the Franco-British Allied Army. Planning for the Western offensive had begun. On the 10th of October came another grim milestone, the creation of the Jewish ghetto in Lublin. Jews from across Poland were rounded up and forced there, and in time, Jews from Pomerania, Silesia, and Austria would also be deported into the ghetto system. Meanwhile, in Moscow, negotiations continued between the Soviet delegation and Lithuania. The Soviets wanted to establish a base in Lithuania and offered a deal. The city of Vilnius, then called Wilno under Polish control, would be transferred to Lithuania in exchange for accepting a Soviet military presence. Lithuania agreed, and the treaty was drafted. Up until then, Kaunas had been the Lithuanian capital, but now Vilnius would become its capital once again. Alongside this, talks continued about the stationing of a limited Soviet force. On the 11th of October, another pivotal event occurred, one that would shape the entire course of history. A group of scientists, including Albert Einstein, signed a letter warning that Germany was working on the development of an atomic bomb. The reaction was initially restrained. Few fully understood what an atomic weapon meant. But in the United States, this marked the first steps toward creating such a project. Stalin also received reports and immediately ordered that the Soviet Union must develop its own atomic program. The most alarming news was that Germany was believed to be close to achieving such a weapon. In the end, of course, the Nazis never managed to build the bomb, thankfully. Back in Poland, the general government was being consolidated under Hans Frank. Deportations of Jews widened, now including Jews from Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Pomerania, who were being forced into ghettos that were, in truth, concentration camps in all but name. At the same time, negotiations opened between the Soviet Union and Finland centered on Leningrad. Stalin was deeply concerned that the city was within easy striking distance of a potential enemy. He demanded that the border be pushed back 40 miles from Leningrad. In addition, the Soviets wanted the Hanko Peninsula and control of the outer islands in the Gulf of Finland, which guarded the approaches to the city. In exchange, Stalin offered Finland a large tract of territory in Karelia, twice the size of the lands he demanded, though far less valuable strategically. The Finns refused. The talks continued, but it was clear that no compromise was likely. On the 14th of October, the British discovered that their old sense of invulnerability from the First World War was gone. Scapa Flow, the Royal Navy's principal base, had been considered impenetrable, protected by anti-aircraft defenses, air cover, and blackouts. Yet into the very heart of the harbor slipped the German submarine U-47, which sank the battleship Royal Oak. 800 men were killed. The attack was carried out with astonishing audacity. The submarine had sailed straight into the harbor, risen to periscope depth, fired its torpedoes, then sank back down and slipped out of the bay. The crew of the Royal Oak at first believed they had been bombed by German aircraft, and chaotic anti-aircraft fire and searchlights erupted, while the submarine calmly departed. The British could hardly imagine that such a disaster could even happen. In the British press, it was reported that German planes had raided Scapa Flow. The Times went so far as to write that only a very old, useless First World War-era dreadnought had been damaged, when in reality one of the Royal Navy's leading battleships had been lost. In mid-October, the Soviet embassy in the Baltic received a secret cable from Molotov. It read, in essence, "Comrades, in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, there exist communist organizations and leftist movements. They are staging demonstrations proclaiming support for the Soviet Union, even declaring that they would like to become part of the USSR. All such contacts must cease. Any activity that could be interpreted as Soviet interference in the internal politics of Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia must be stopped. No meetings, no receptions of this so-called popular delegations. Expel them if they approach you. Hand them over to the local police if necessary. We do not want to interfere in or undermine the sovereignty of the Baltic states. Our only goal is to establish bases there. Forget everything else." This remains a subject of debate. Was Stalin from the beginning intent on annexing the Baltics? We cannot know his mind for certain. The fact remains that the Baltic states were ultimately annexed. But at least in this first phase, Molotov repeatedly sent such instructions and would continue to do so into 1940, strictly forbidding Soviet diplomats from any dealings with sympathetic local organizations, precisely to prevent accusations that Moscow was meddling in Baltic domestic politics. Meanwhile, in Germany, the first open conflict erupted between the SS and the Wehrmacht. After the Polish campaign, Wehrmacht generals sent Hitler a letter insisting that many SS officers ought to be tried. They accused them of torture, atrocities, and looting. "We are a professional Prussian officer corps," the generals implied, "while these are nothing but thugs and cutthroats." Letters were written to Hitler. Hitler took the SS under his protection and issued a decree that from the 17th of October, SS officers and, in fact, any SS personnel would not be subject to military field courts. For all their crimes, they would be tried by their own courts, and this provoked a terrible conflict. The Wehrmacht answered that they were a professional officer corps, and these marauders were corrupting them, utterly unworthy of the Prussian officer's spirit. They were thugs and cutthroats, but Hitler refused to listen. He defended the SS because he regarded them as his personal guard, and of course, he would protect them. Only after the war would the consequences become fully clear, but at that moment, only the Germans themselves understood what was underway. Plans regarding Poland became clearer. Later, after the war, the diaries of General Halder would become available, in which he recorded that in Poland the main targets were to be the elites, landowners, industrialists, the intelligentsia, and clergymen. They must be isolated in camps or executed. Poland was to become a general government territory with a very low standard of living, a place from which slave labor would be dragged to Germany to supply everything the Reich needed: agricultural products, farm produce, some factory output, and so on. In short, the goal was to create a slave region. This would later be stated at Nuremberg, but on the 18th of October, Halder already wrote it in his diary. I will quote him directly. He wrote that at the Führer's meeting today on the Polish problem, the discussed points were that we do not intend to restore Poland. Precautionary measures against proposals are not concluded. A bridgehead for future German actions, Poland must have its own local organs of self-government. It must not be ruled according to German standards. It must be prevented that the Polish intelligentsia become the ruling class. It is necessary to maintain a low standard of living, cheap slaves. All undesirable elements must be expelled from German territories. Clearly, he was summarizing theses voiced by the Führer at the meeting. This account matters for two reasons. First, it shows what the Germans thought about the occupied territories. Second, the date, the 18th of October, 1939, matters. A historical myth claims that on that date, Hitler and Stalin secretly met in Lviv. Two armored trains arrived. Hitler stepped out of one, Stalin out of the other, and the whole city was cordoned off by Soviet and German troops. But German forces had already left that area. Where would this story come from? Hoover, head of the FBI, wrote a memorandum to President Roosevelt's aide asserting that, according to our information, there had been a secret meeting. Why meet secretly if they were exchanging documents in Moscow through Molotov and their channels were open? It makes no sense. It is a myth. We know Stalin kept a meticulous diary and was meeting with Molotov and Zhdanov then, and Hitler was holding a meeting about Poland on the 18th, so there could be no secret rendezvous in Lviv. On the 19th of October, German troops began deployment under Operation Gelb, the offensive against France, and the plan was approved. Hitler announced that the invasion of France would take place in November. In Turkey, interesting talks took place among Britain, France, and Turkey, and a treaty was signed. Within that framework, the British discussed an aerial strike on the city of Baku. Why? Once war began, the British sought to blockade German seaports to deny the Reich food and vital materials. The Germans fought a submarine war and sank Allied merchantmen. Yet, because of the pact with the Soviet Union, Germany received oil and grain by rail. The French and British thus planned to bomb Baku, Batumi, and Poti, to use Iranian and Turkish airfields to strike Soviet oil fields and thereby deny oil to Germany. Predictably, leaks made this known in Moscow. At the same time, Molotov again sent dispatches to the Baltic embassies. He would do this weekly, insisting that no embassy should engage with communist elements in those countries. On the 19th, he sent another cipher telegram forbidding any contact with friendly communist organizations. Also, on the 19th in America, an important date, the first meeting of the Uranium Committee took place, where work on an American atomic weapons program was discussed. Returning to Europe, the Gelb plan that Hitler had approved was resisted by the General Staff. Keitel fiercely criticized it. Inspections of the troops led the generals to tell Hitler plainly that they were not ready for war. Chief of the General Staff Halder made an inspection and realized that under this plan, some units would not keep up with others. Logistics would rupture, supplies would fail, convoys would be cut on the march. In short, they were not prepared. Hitler dismissed these objections. "This is your nonsense. You said the same about Poland. We won in 2 weeks there, so we will attack France in November." But poor weather hindered air operations, and the Gelb timetable was delayed again and again. Ultimately, the offensive would not take place until May of the following year, 1940, and fierce fights would follow. Within this struggle, a conspiracy against Hitler fermented. The same plot I discussed previously in the history lesson on Operation Valkyrie. The German generals kept hoping Hitler could be removed. Many believed war with France and Britain would end in catastrophe for Germany, as in 1818 they were convinced they would receive no help and that they were unready. In November, in Moscow, a second round of negotiations took place between Finland and the Soviet Union. The positions were unchanged. The Soviets demanded the border be pushed back by 40 to 70 kilometers, and the islands surrendered. In exchange, they offered vast territories in Karelia, twice the size of what they asked for strategically. The Finns stood firm. At the same time, the Military Council presented Stalin with an operational plan for smashing Finland's land army and navy. The Soviet Union thus began preparing for war with Finland. It is clear that the negotiations would stall. Another notable event unfolds in the Atlantic. Off the coast of Argentina, the modern German cruiser Admiral Graf von Spee is operating in the southern seas to sink Allied shipping. One of its prizes is a huge shell tanker displacing 706 tons. It sinks her. Graf von Spee will be a thorn in the side of the British, raging all through the autumn and into the early winter in the Atlantic, sending to the bottom a great number of Allied tankers and cargo ships and becoming a genuine headache for the Admiralty. In Japan, the situation worsens. War imposes enormous economic strain. The Japanese compulsorily fix purchase prices for rice and forcibly buy up grain from peasants because rice is needed for the army. Back in Germany in early November, the conflict between the General Staff and Hitler continues. Von Brockisch tries to dissuade Hitler from invading. Hitler intends to invade France on the 12th of November. On the 6th, he summons Admiral Canaris, chief of the Abwehr and one of the most prominent intelligence figures of the Second World War, and asks him to repeat the Gleiwitz-style staging, this time involving Belgians and Dutch, so as to use their territories for the invasion of France. Canaris voices doubts, and in general, nearly everyone at that moment opposes Hitler's scheme. On the 7th of November, the Gelb plan is postponed because of bad weather, and on the 8th of November, something terrible happens. An assassination attempt is made on Hitler in Munich at the Bürgerbräukeller beer hall. Georg Elser tried to kill Hitler. He failed. Elsair was captured and would remain in concentration camps until April of 1945, when, in the final days of the war, he would be executed. The invasion of France is postponed not because the generals persuaded Hitler, but because the weather made operations impossible. The general staff, it is striking to note, including the future senior commanders of the Reich such as Lieb, Rundstedt, and von Bock, all tried to warn Hitler. They argued that he had lost his mind and that Germany was not ready for this war. Yet the delay came for meteorological reasons, not because of their objections. In Poland, on the 11th of November, the anniversary of Polish independence, on the 11th of November 1918, underground leaflets circulate in Warsaw urging people to hang Polish flags from balconies and otherwise signal to the occupiers that they remain an independent nation. Hans Frank, the Governor-General, issues a decree that if a Polish flag or Polish leaflets are found on any house, all residents of that building will be shot. This applied to every settlement and especially to Warsaw. In Germany, the economic situation kept deteriorating. Ration cards were now issued even for clothing. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the final round of negotiations with Finland was underway, and the Finns rejected Stalin's proposals. Stalin then uttered his famous phrase, "Well, my friends, the Finns, just look at the situation. From Leningrad to the border is only this distance. Neither you nor we can do anything about it. I cannot physically move Leningrad deeper into the country, which means the border will have to move." The Finns understood that war with the Soviet Union was coming. On November 17th, under cover of darkness, the Germans began large-scale mining of British coastal waters, particularly off Scotland. These mines were a nightmare for the British. The Times reported that every week the British and Allied merchant fleets lost a total of about 60 tons of cargo due to ships striking mines. Countless ships were being destroyed, and at first nothing could be done against these weapons. At the same time, headlines were dominated by the story of the cruiser Admiral Graf von Spee, which kept sinking ships in the Atlantic. Criticism poured onto the Admiralty. Are we rulers of the seas or not? How can a single German cruiser in the Atlantic take 2, 3, 4 of our ships every week? The British began preparing a response. Another notable moment. General Blaskowitz from occupied Poland wrote a letter about SS atrocities, reporting looting, violence, and executions of civilians without trial. Hitler scribbled a note in the margin. The Wehrmacht is not a Salvation Army. Mind your own business. So even the Wehrmacht, supposedly part of the same war machine as the SS, was protesting in writing about what the SS was doing. On November 21st, Molotov commented in the press on the Soviet-Finnish negotiations, mockingly calling the Finnish government court jesters for refusing Soviet terms. Meanwhile, Admiral Graf von Spee continued its rampage in the Atlantic, sinking 27,000 tons of shipping in just 2 weeks. Newspapers wrote weekly about the cruiser's destruction and about German magnetic mines, which seemed unstoppable. The British were lucky. They eventually recovered 2 mines near the coast, disassembled them, and learned how they worked. From then on, British ships were fitted with so-called degaussing coils that generated an electrical field, neutralizing the mine's magnetic trigger. This innovation made the fleet much safer. On November 25th, France and Britain imposed a complete blockade on German military and commercial ports, cutting Germany off from overseas supplies. Yet this was no real problem for Germany, which was still receiving vital resources from the Soviet Union and partly from Sweden, which supplied essential iron ore. On November 26th, two important events occurred. First, in Ireland, still under the United Kingdom, the Irish Republican Army, which fought for independence, was contacted by the Germans. Agents were sent, and Berlin planned a submarine operation to land 2 units of saboteurs to start a campaign of sabotage in Belfast, targeting British ships. The operation ultimately never came to fruition. Second, the so-called Manila incident occurred on the Finnish border. According to the Soviets, Finnish artillery shelled Soviet territory. The Finns denied it, insisting they had no artillery anywhere near there, all their guns being concentrated on the Mannerheim Line. Nevertheless, the USSR declared it a gross violation of the border, a provocation. The Soviet Foreign Ministry sent a protest note. The Finns proposed a joint commission to investigate. The Soviets refused. On November 29th, the USSR broke off diplomatic relations with Finland, and on November 30th, Soviet troops invaded Finnish territory. November ended with 2 more events that would echo decades later. In Bosnia, Muslims demanded autonomy and the creation of their own state, something they were denied, but a spark that would flare up in the 1990s during the Yugoslav wars. Meanwhile, in the British colony of Bahrain, calls arose for a constitution, essentially for independence. 2 seemingly small events in very different corners of the world, but both seeds of future conflicts. The Soviet Union hurled 425,000 soldiers and officers, 2,200 tanks, and 2,400 aircraft into the war with Finland. In sheer numbers, that meant a 3-to-1 superiority over the Finnish army. But the Finns knew how to fight a winter war. They had the formidable Mannerheim Line, and soon they would begin using guerrilla tactics with great success. At first, the war seemed to go well for the Soviets. They captured Petsamo. Immediately afterward, Moscow set up a new puppet government, led by Finnish communist Otto Kuusinen, called the Terijoki government, named after the village where it was proclaimed. Soviet newspapers announced that the legitimate Finnish government had fled from Helsinki. From now on, they claimed, there was no other Finnish authority, only Kuusinen's government, with which the USSR would negotiate peace and conduct diplomacy. The international reaction to the Winter War was swift and harsh. The United States imposed a moral embargo on certain types of equipment exports to the Soviet Union. Britain and France declared their intention to assist Finland. Sweden organized a volunteer corps, and Denmark did the same, sending about 600 men to fight alongside the Finns. The most dramatic step came when the Soviet Union was expelled from the League of Nations, the forerunner of today's United Nations. By then, however, the League had already been weakened. Both the U.S. and Germany were no longer members. So this organization, too, was basically toothless. An interesting event unfolds in the United States against this background. Roosevelt demanded that Congress raise the military budget to $1.3 billion. This was an unprecedented sum, and Congress was unsure why such an increase was necessary. They understood that everyone was preparing for war, but the Americans still did not want to join it. Debates began in Congress. Military aid to Finland was not limited to volunteers. The Swedes sent 11,000 men, the Norwegians about 1,000. The Danes as I said, roughly 600. Britain and France sent aircraft and weapons. South Africa even supplied some planes, and the United States extended a loan of $10 million. In short, Europe formed a united front of support for the Finns. At the other end of the world, China launched its first large counteroffensive at Wuhan, the city we now know in the 21st century as the initial epicenter of the coronavirus. Even then, it was a sizable province, and Chinese forces began to counterattack the Japanese. The Winter War opened well for the Soviet Union, as I mentioned, but that initial success lasted barely a week. By the 12th of November, the Soviet 163rd Division found itself encircled. The Finns adopted guerrilla methods, a style of fighting later widely studied and admired. Their approach is often described by the word moti. A moti is a stack of wood. Metaphorically, it describes how a column on the march is cut into pieces. A Soviet column on a narrow forest road would be stopped when the front and the rear vehicles were failed or blocked. The column could not disperse. Then snipers and light detachments would harass and split the trapped units. Finnish snipers, the so-called cuckoos, perched in trees, picked off men precisely. Whether they always literally sat in trees is debated, but there is no doubt that Finnish sharpshooters worked with extraordinary skill and coordination. The tactic was often not to burn captured vehicles, but to leave them intact. Let the men freeze to death, then collect the usable material afterward. The moti tactic proved highly effective. Soviet columns became hopelessly strung out on marches. Artillery lagged behind. Convoys were torn apart on the move. December saw catastrophe after catastrophe for Moscow, encirclement and destruction at Tovaharvi on the 12th of December. On the 14th of December, the 168th Army was surrounded near Lake Ladoga. Later in December, the 18th Rifle Division under General Kondrashov and the 34th Tank Brigade under Brigade Commander Kondratiev were encircled. By the 8th of January, the 44th Division would be annihilated in the battle at the Rada Road. Finnish ski detachments would pour out of the forests, dissect the Soviet forces into columns, and destroy them one by one. It was, in short, a disaster. The Soviet Union had not expected to face this method of warfare and was unprepared for it. The household incendiary that later became famous as the Molotov cocktail was born during the Soviet-Finnish War. The Finns mocked the Soviet airdrop propaganda with a popular song called No, Molotov, and the nickname stuck. The story goes like this. Soviet aviation bombed Finnish towns. When the Finns protested that civilian buildings were being destroyed, Molotov, in propaganda broadcasts, claimed the Soviets were actually dropping bread baskets on Helsinki to feed the starving population. In reply, the Finns said, "If Molotov is delivering food, we'll send him a present." And that present was the improvised incendiary, the Molotov cocktail, a simple, cheap, and effective flame weapon made by hand. It was mass-produced in factories and proved extremely effective against Soviet armored vehicles. On December 13, 1939, the British Admiralty finally carried out a successful operation against the heavy cruiser Admiral Graf Spee off the River Plate near the coast of Uruguay. 3 British cruisers engaged the German raider. One was badly damaged, but the other 2 broke through the zone where Graf Spee could shell them from a distance and managed to inflict serious damage. The German cruiser was forced to take refuge in Montevideo, Uruguay. The government there granted 3 days for repairs and departure. But with British warships blockading the harbor exit, there was no way out. The Germans scuttled the Graf Spee, and the entire crew, along with Captain Hans Langsdorff, was evacuated to Buenos Aires. Here history turned in a strange circle. The Graf Spee had been named after Admiral Maximilian von Spee, commander of the German squadron in the same region during World War I. He had fought successfully for a time, but was eventually destroyed by the British off the Falkland Islands, dying alongside his 2 sons. Now, 2 decades later, a ship bearing his name met almost the same fate, sunk by the British in nearly the same waters. On December 20th, Captain Langsdorff wrapped himself in the ship's battle flag in a Buenos Aires hotel room and shot himself, in keeping with the old Prussian officer's code that a captain must share the fate of his ship. Meanwhile, Germany's U-boat campaign continued, inflicting heavy losses on Britain. In mid-December, Hitler began planning Operation Weserübung, the invasions of Denmark and Norway. With Germany's seaports blockaded, the vital iron ore route from Sweden through Norway was in danger. If the British and French seized Norwegian ports, Germany's iron lifeline would be cut. The British, for their part, together with France, were drawing up their own plans, air raids on Batumi, Poti, and Baku, to deprive Germany of Soviet oil. They also discussed with the Turks ways of sparking anti-Soviet uprisings along the border, using white émigrés and Turkish intelligence. In China, by mid-December, the large-scale counteroffensive at Wuhan collapsed with heavy losses, and Chinese forces fell back to their earlier positions. Thus ended 1939, the first year of the Second World War. It closed with an IRA bombing in Dublin at Magazine Fort, which destroyed a British garrison depot. Pope Pius XII, in his December address, called upon all nations to sit at the table of peace, but no one listened. Meanwhile, the French were gathering intelligence on Soviet oil facilities in the Caucasus, seriously considering joint raids on Baku and other oil fields. Japan ended 1939 with 1.1 million troops in China bogged down in an endless war. The British press reported catastrophic shipping losses. 114 merchant ships sunk in a single week by German U-boats, nearly a quarter of Britain's overseas supplies cut off. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was bogged down in Finland. Ill-prepared for winter warfare, Red Army units were shredded by ski troops, minefields, and terrain-based tactics. Entire divisions froze, starved, or were annihilated. By year's end, the German General Staff had studied the campaign and reported to Hitler. The Soviet army was in fact weak, its size a bluff. This was when Hitler coined his phrase, "The Red Army is a colossus with feet of clay." So ended 1939. Poland crushed, France and Britain locked in the Phoney War against Germany, the Reich triumphant at sea, Japan bogged down in China, and the Soviet Union bleeding in Finland. The first year of World War II had ended.